On the 4th of June, 1943, along Railroad Street in Mexia, Texas, Unificia Vera Burkhart's hand, holding a pencil, experienced a slight tremor as he inscribed words into his clandestine journal. These very notations, had they been unearthed by his superiors, would have led to his immediate solitary confinement. He penned, "The Americans must be deceiving us. No single nation could possibly sustain such an overwhelming abundance while engaged in a conflict on two separate fronts." Through the glass of the train carriage, he had just witnessed an astonishing spectacle that directly contradicted 3 years of relentless Nazi propaganda. Electric illumination, vibrant and ceaseless, blazed from every rural dwelling, each street intersection, and the storefronts of countless businesses. It was an unending celestial tapestry of light, an electrical constellation stretching across the vast plains of Texas at 10 o'clock in the evening. Back in Germany, the pervasive blackout directives, implemented since 1940, had plunged the entire Reich into an impenetrable darkness. Even preceding the onset of hostilities, rural electrification had managed to reach barely 20% of German farms. Yet here, in what Nazi propaganda had painted as a nation in decadent collapse, electricity flowed with the ease and volume of water. 1,850 veterans of Erwin RML's Afrika Korps disembarked from the passenger train. They were not disembarking from cattle cars or crude freight wagons, but from luxuriously appointed Pullman coaches, complete with onboard dining facilities and sleeping accommodations. The entirety of Mexia's population had assembled to observe their arrival. What none of them could have possibly foreseen was that this singular moment would serve as the catalyst for the most profound psychological upheaval in modern history, a meticulously orchestrated dismantling of Nazi ideology through the sheer, unadulterated demonstration of American industrial might. The arithmetic of Allied triumph was not being calculated within the confines of battle plans, but rather within the stark figures of production statistics, figures that would soon obliterate every deeply ingrained assumption these soldiers harbored about their adversaries, their homeland, and the righteousness of their cause. The initial phase of this dramatic turn of events had commenced on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, the successor to Rommel, had surrendered along with an estimated 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian servicemen. These figures fluctuated slightly as scattered remnants continued to yield over several subsequent days. The Wehrmacht's most seasoned desert warriors, men who had previously driven the British forces back to the borders of Egypt, who had even garnered the grudging admiration of Montgomery himself, were now unexpectedly confined as prisoners of war. Among them was Headman Friedrich Radke, a recipient of the Iron Cross First Class, a seasoned veteran of the French campaign, and a man wounded twice during combat in North Africa. His personal diary, rediscovered decades later within the repositories of the National Archives, would ultimately provide historians with the most exhaustive account of the psychological repercussions experienced by German soldiers during their captivity in America. The transition from their perception of defeat to a profound revelation began in the bustling port of Oran, Algeria. As Radke and approximately 30,000 other prisoners awaited transport ships in hastily erected encampments, the renowned efficiency of the American military machinery was already beginning to erode their firmly held preconceptions. The United States Army processed thousands of prisoners daily with an organizational precision that far surpassed anything the Wehrmacht had accomplished, even at the zenith of its formidable power. Identification documents were meticulously photographed and cataloged. Comprehensive medical examinations were conducted, essential inoculations were administered, and the stipulations of the Geneva Convention were expounded upon in fluent German by American officers who had received specialized training precisely for this critical juncture. However, the initial true shock awaited them with the provision of sustenance. Oberleutnant Hans Muhr, who had been captured alongside the 21st Panzer Division, penned a letter to his mother 8 months later. He recalled, "Within the confines of the cage at Oran, while we awaited our passage on ships, the Americans provided us with food superior to anything we had consumed during 6 months of desert warfare. We received white bread, genuine coffee, and meat twice a day. Initially, we believed this was a deliberate act of propaganda, an attempt to impress us. we failed to grasp that this was, in fact, their standard military ration. The very Liberty ships destined to convey them across the vast expanse of the Atlantic were themselves imposing testaments to America's immense industrial prowess. The SS Robert E. Lee had been constructed in a mere 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser shipyard situated in Richmond, California. This astonishing accomplishment, if known to the Germans at the time, would have been summarily dismissed as outlandish, unbelievable propaganda. These vessels, with their production rate reaching 3 per day at the apex of their manufacturing output, were returning from their voyages of supplying the European theater. Rather than undertaking their return journeys empty, they were repurposed to transport human cargo, accommodating upwards of 30,000 prisoners of war monthly by the summer of 1943. The fortnight-long transatlantic crossing undertaken in July of 1943 marked the second decisive phase in this systematic psychological demolition. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division meticulously chronicled his experiences in correspondence to his family following his repatriation. He noted that the ship's crew, on a daily basis, disposed of more discarded food than his entire company had received in weekly rations during the concluding months of their deployment in Africa. Zimmermann vividly described the scene. The American sailors would discard half-eaten steaks, entire loaves of bread, and gallons of milk that had sat out too long, he wrote. They did this openly, without apparent concern, not to mock us, but because to them this waste signified nothing. Their supply was virtually limitless. The vessels themselves transformed into floating educational institutions, imparting lessons on American power. Prisoners soon discovered that the very ship carrying them was but one unit within a fleet of 2,710 Liberty ships that would be constructed throughout the duration of the war. Each of these monumental vessels required a staggering 250,000 individual parts, meticulously assembled from components manufactured across 32 separate states. The engines, as they learned from engaging with voluble American guards, were produced in 3 distinct factories, each capable of generating 900 horsepower cylinders. These were then subsequently assembled in port facilities that had, astonishingly, barely existed 2 years prior. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, whose aristocratic Prussian lineage had a proud history of service in every German conflict dating back to the era of Frederick the Great, would later reflect in his memoirs. As our ship drew closer to the American coastline, I observed the radar antenna rotating ceaselessly above the bridge. This technology, which we firmly believed was possessed exclusively by ourselves, and perhaps in limited quantities by the British, was standard equipment on what was merely a cargo vessel. He confessed, "It was at that precise moment I first harbored the suspicion that Germany had, in fact, already lost the war." On the 2nd of August, 1943, at the Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, the initial visual encounter with America itself served to utterly shatter the lingering remnants of Nazi propaganda concerning America's purported industrial frailty. The Norfolk base was an expansive complex, sprawling across 4,300 acres, its docks extending for miles, and its numerous cranes engaged in the simultaneous loading and unloading of dozens of vessels. In a single day, this single port facility handled a greater volume of cargo tonnage than the entirety of the German port of Hamburg managed in an entire week. Gefreiter Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr region prior to his conscription, meticulously counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of either being loaded or unloaded. He recorded in his secret diary, "Each crane lifted loads that, back in Germany, would have necessitated the combined efforts of a dozen men and their horses. They moved with an effortless electric power, smoothly and continuously, devoid of the choking coal smoke that so often obscured our industrial cities." The prisoners were then organized into formations for their march towards the waiting trains. Along the designated route, they passed vast parking areas filled to capacity with civilian automobiles, hundreds upon hundreds of them, all belonging to the dock workers. In Germany, private automobile ownership was a privilege strictly reserved for the affluent and the ruling party elite. The Volkswagen, a vehicle promised to the German populace since 1934, remained largely an aspirational propaganda fabrication, with fewer than 1,000 units ever having been delivered to civilians. Here, however, ordinary laborers drove to their places of employment in their own personal vehicles. Yet, nothing could have truly prepared them for the spectacle of the trains themselves. These were not rudimentary boxcars, nor were they the cramped 40-and-8 wagons, 40 men or 8 horses, that had historically transported German troops across the continent of Europe. Instead, they were opulent passenger coaches, complete with plush Pullman accommodations that could be converted into sleeping berths. They featured elegant dining cars adorned with pristine white tablecloths and gleaming silver cutlery, and even observation cars offering panoramic vistas through their expansive windows. Headman Radke eloquently documented his experience. "We boarded as if we were mere tourists, not prisoners." The American guards themselves appeared almost apologetic regarding the level of comfort provided. One sergeant even offered an apology, stating that the air conditioning in their particular car was not functioning optimally. Air conditioning. In the sweltering heat of August, they had genuinely believed that such a level of luxury existed solely aboard Hitler's private train. The 3-day train journey from Norfolk to the internment camps located in Texas and Oklahoma would ultimately prove more destructive to the ingrained fabric of Nazi ideology than any battlefield defeat could have accomplished. As the trains made their steady progress through Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces against the windows, their eyes feasting upon a vision of America that was diametrically opposed to everything they had been indoctrinated to believe. Every small town they passed blazed with brilliant illumination. Communities such as Martinsville, Danville, and Greensboro, which in Germany would have been fortunate to possess a single electric street lamp, here displayed brightly lit shop windows, vibrant electric signs, and numerous houses where lights burned brightly in multiple rooms. The trains also traversed areas adjacent to factories that were operating on night shifts, their windows glowing warmly, and their extensive parking lots filled with vehicles even at the midnight hour. Oberleutnant Muir, whose father had served as a Nazi Party block leader in Hamburg, recounted in a letter discovered in 1987, "We journeyed through dozens of cities that first night. Every single one possessed more electricity than the entirety of Hamburg." He further noted, "The guards informed us that this was considered normal, that every American town had been supplied with electricity since the 1920s. I vehemently accused him of lying. He merely shrugged his shoulders and remarked that we would soon see for ourselves." In Roanoke, Virginia, the train made a necessary stop for water and coal. The imprisoned soldiers observed American railway workers execute in approximately 30 minutes what would have typically required 2 full hours in Germany. The operation involved automated coal loaders, efficient electric water pumps, and advanced mechanized lubrication systems. Every facet of this logistical undertaking served as a stark demonstration of technological superiority. Even more unsettling was the casual display of wealth exhibited by the workers themselves. They were clad in leather boots that, in Germany, would have represented the equivalent of 2 months' wages for a typical laborer. They consumed Coca-Cola directly from glass bottles, casually discarding the empties into conveniently located bins without a second thought. They smoked cigarettes incessantly, frequently stubbing out half-finished ones. Feuerwehrmann Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer hailing from Bremen before the war, calculated that the single railway yard they had paused in consumed more electricity in the span of 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin utilized in a full day. He poignantly wrote, "The waste was magnificent." They deliberately left lights burning in unoccupied buildings. Electric fans whirred in vacant rooms. This was, he observed, the hallmark of a boundless, almost careless, abundance. As the trains progressed into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners were confronted with the full, unbridled display of American industrial might. Through the carriage windows, they witnessed an unbroken succession of factories, each one colossal in scale, far exceeding anything most had ever seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 miles along the riverbank, its electric furnaces voraciously consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, a figure exceeding the total energy consumption of the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the trains perceptibly slowed as they navigated through the rubber town complex, a sprawling area where synthetic rubber plants had rapidly emerged from previously undeveloped fields in a remarkably short period of just 18 months. These were 4 immense facilities, each employing thousands of workers and collectively producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. In stark contrast, Germany, despite having pioneered the very process, had never managed to produce more than 120,000 tons in its most productive year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist affiliated with IG Farben, immediately grasped the profound implications of this industrial might. In a post-war interview, he recalled, "I recognized those plants. I could clearly discern the distillation columns and the catalytic crackers." Each individual facility was demonstrably more advanced than anything we had managed to construct, and there were 4 of them located within this single industrial zone. We were informed that dozens more such complexes existed across the nation. The trains also passed Ford's Willow Run plant, located just outside Detroit, a structure so immense it was visible from miles away. This singular manufacturing facility, erected in a mere 9 months, was capable of producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At its peak operational capacity, 42,000 workers were engaged in the assembly of bombers from 1,550,000 individual parts, sourced from approximately 1,500 subcontractor companies. The plant occupied a colossal 2.5 million square feet of floor space and consumed more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hutman Verli, a Luftwaffe pilot who had been shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window as they glided past. He meticulously counted 17 B-24 bombers in various stages of assembly that were visible from the train. "We had been consistently told that American aircraft were inferior, hastily constructed, and prone to falling apart in combat," he stated. "But I could clearly observe the precision of the assembly lines, the impeccable quality of the construction. These were not inferior aircraft by any measure. They were simply manufactured at a speed we had previously considered utterly impossible." The further these trains penetrated into the heartland of America, the more complete and devastating became the erosion of Nazi mythology. In St. Louis, the train traversed the mighty Mississippi River via the Eads Bridge. Below, barges laden with grain flowed past, carrying a volume of agricultural produce that surpassed the entirety of the German harvest for 1942. From the train, the prisoners could discern towering grain elevators stretching along both riverbanks, each one containing enough wheat to sustain an entire German city for several months. Unofficier Karl Schmidt, the son of a farmer from Bavaria, inscribed in his diary, "The Americans transport their food supplies with the same seemingly limitless quantities and lack of concern for loss that we reserve for ammunition. I watched them load a single barge with sufficient wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was casually enjoying a sandwich with a substantial portion of meat, thicker than our weekly allowance." In Kansas City, the train halted at a vast stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle awaited processing. The pervasive aroma of meatpacking plants permeated the air for miles around. German prisoners of war, who in Africa, when fortunate, subsisted on a mere 200 grams of meat per week, now observed American workers consuming hearty beef sandwiches during their lunch breaks. Gefreiter Paul Fischer wrote, "They consumed meat as we consumed bread. No, that is incorrect. They consumed meat as we desperately wished we could consume bread." A guard purchased hamburgers for them from a nearby stand. A generous offering of meat, cheese, and vegetables nestled within soft white bread, all for a mere 15 cents. He bought 20 of these without a moment's hesitation, paying with a single dollar bill. This was not a special meal. This was their everyday fare. The arrival at the internment camps themselves marked the subsequent stage of profound cognitive dissonance. Camp Hearn in Texas, constructed in a mere 4 months, provided accommodation for between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions that surpassed what most had experienced even as civilians. The camp featured sturdy wooden barracks equipped with electric lighting, flushing toilets, hot showers, and efficient steam heating systems. Each individual building was erected using more lumber than entire German villages could collectively possess. The camp's hospital facility proved particularly astonishing to the medical professionals among the prisoners. Oberstabsarzt, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, the chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself within a facility that was demonstrably superior to most German civilian hospitals. It boasted state-of-the-art X-ray machines, comprehensive surgical equipment, and an abundance of pharmaceutical supplies that had been virtually unobtainable in Germany since 1941. All of these amenities were considered standard provisions for enemy prisoners. They possessed penicillin, Dr. Bauer would later testify, this miraculous drug about which we had only heard whispers. They administered it freely, even to prisoners suffering from minor infections. German soldiers were perishing due to a lack of basic sulfa drugs, while the Americans were generously providing us with their most advanced medical treatments without any hesitation. The camp kitchen emerged as another educational arena, vividly illustrating the extent of American prosperity. Prisoners assigned to culinary duties discovered walk-in refrigerators, powerful electric mixers, automated dishwashing machines, and modern gas ranges capable of preparing meals for 5,000 individuals simultaneously. The daily ration routinely included fresh milk, eggs, meat, a variety of vegetables, and white bread, quantities that German civilians had not seen since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, meticulously recorded, "Today, we discarded more food than my entire family has seen in the past 3 years. This was not spoiled food, but simply excess. American regulations mandate that we prepare 10% more than is absolutely necessary to ensure every prisoner receives a full portion. The surplus is then disposed of. Tears streamed down my face as I threw perfectly good bread into the garbage." By September of 1943, the burgeoning labor shortage within American agriculture necessitated the employment of prisoners of war in fields and factories across the nation. This pragmatic decision, driven by sheer necessity, proved to be far more effective in undermining Nazi ideology than any extensive propaganda campaign could have possibly achieved. Groups of prisoners were transported daily to various work sites, traversing the American heartland without the imposition of blindfolds or restricted routes. They were exposed to everything. They witnessed the endless expanses of corn and wheat fields, the factories operating around the clock on 3 shifts, the shops brimming with merchandise, the parking lots overflowing with automobiles, and the houses equipped with refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin located outside Houston, unofficier Herbert Lang observed a single machine processing more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could have managed in a month, utilizing traditional methods. The gin was powered by electricity supplied by the Colorado River Authority, an integral part of a rural electrification program that had successfully brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned the gin, Lang meticulously documented, was by no means an individual of special status, not of aristocratic lineage, nor a member of the ruling party, simply a farmer. Yet, he possessed electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His laborers, including those of African descent, partook in lunch from containers brimming with more food than German workers received in an entire week. And this, he noted, was considered entirely normal. Every farm they passed presented the same remarkable tableau. In Nebraska, prisoners were engaged in work within sugar beet fields, witnessing agricultural mechanization that defied comprehension. A single combine harvester, they learned, possessed the capacity to perform the labor of 100 men. The fields stretched as far as the eye could see, each one encompassing an area larger than entire German counties. The farmers spoke casually of harvest yields that would have been considered mere fantasy in Germany, reporting 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's average of 30 on its most fertile land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm near Scottsbluff, wrote, "The farmer's son, a mere 16-year-old boy, was operating a tractor valued higher than everything my father had accumulated in his entire lifetime." He added, "When I mentioned this observation, the boy simply laughed and remarked that it wasn't even a particularly exceptional tractor. His father was eagerly awaiting the arrival of a new model from John Deere, which he assured me would be even more impressive." The most profoundly devastating revelations were reserved for those prisoners who worked in close proximity to, or directly within, American factories. While the stringent regulations of the Geneva Convention explicitly prohibited prisoners from engaging in direct war production activities, they were permitted to labor in industries that effectively freed up American workers for military-related tasks. This subtle but significant technicality allowed thousands of German prisoners to gain direct, first-hand exposure to the sheer magnitude of American industrial capacity. At a Campbell's soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners observed production lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than most German factories handled in a month. The facility operated with a remarkably lean workforce consisting primarily of women and elderly men, as the majority of younger, able-bodied workers were serving in the military. Despite this, production levels consistently exceeded those of pre-war peacetime standards. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had been employed in a German food processing plant before the war, meticulously documented his experience. He described a scene of complete automation. Everything was automated: electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, and steam cookers that processed hundreds of cans simultaneously. One elderly woman was overseeing controls that managed a process which, in Germany, would have required the labor of 50 workers. She accomplished this remarkable feat while simultaneously listening to the radio and sipping coffee. Near Detroit, prisoners engaged in the unloading of coal at a power plant were afforded fleeting glimpses of the automotive industry's extensive conversion to war production. The River Rouge complex, visible across the water, employed a staggering 100,000 workers and was actively producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. This colossal plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, a figure that surpassed the total consumption of the entire city of Hamburg. "We could see the parking lots," wrote Oberleutnant Franz Kellner, "filled with thousands upon thousands of cars belonging to the workers. Workers in Germany. Even our own officers rarely owned automobiles. Here, factory workers routinely drove to their jobs. The guard informed us that many of these workers owned 2 cars, one for commuting to work and another for family use." We initially believed he was attempting to mock us. By the winter of 1943, the cumulative impact of these widespread observations was producing what American intelligence officers termed ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoner population. The Special Projects Division, a clandestine re-education initiative orchestrated by the Provost Marshal General's Office, documented an increasing number of prisoners expressing a desire to access American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Noland, a member of the monitoring team, reported in December of 1943, "The prisoners no longer engage in arguments when presented with production statistics. They have witnessed far too much. The most fanatical Nazis have become conspicuously silent. While they may still profess loyalty to Germany, they no longer speak of achieving victory. Many openly question the information they were previously fed about America." The camp newspapers, independently produced by the prisoners themselves, began to mirror this profound internal transformation. Der Ruf, the publication issued at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually shifted its focus from expressions of defiant nationalism to thoughtful discussions on the principles of democracy, economic systems, and the intricate complexities of post-war reconstruction. The editors, carefully selected for their anti-Nazi sentiments, discovered that their audience was increasingly receptive to these evolving themes. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, conveyed in a letter that successfully bypassed American censorship, "Send only text, no instructions or comments. We were misled into believing America was a fractured, weak union of disparate peoples, susceptible to external manipulation and lacking military might. Yet, with each passing day spent here, I witnessed the exact opposite. This nation stands as the most cohesive, unified, and formidable entity on the planet. We were fed falsehoods by deceitful individuals. The most significant blow to the very foundation of Nazi ideology originated from an entirely unexpected quarter: the treatment of Italian soldiers subsequent to Italy's capitulation in September of 1943. Those Italian prisoners of war who chose to collaborate were integrated into Italian service units, provided with superior accommodations, increased remuneration, and greater liberties. German prisoners observed their erstwhile comrades laboring alongside Americans, dining in American establishments, and in some instances, forming relationships with American women. Hetman Friedrich Schultz chronicled this phenomenon, stating, "The Italians betrayed us, and yet they are treated with more consideration than we extended to them when they were our allies. They labor freely, earn wages, and dispatch provisions to their homes. The Americans harbor no animosity towards them. This system of democracy, which we were conditioned to disdain, demonstrates a greater ethical standing than our own." The Christmas season of 1943 delivered the most profound psychological impact. American organizations, religious bodies, and community groups dispatched 500,000 Christmas parcels to German prisoners of war, adversaries who had, mere months prior, actively sought the demise of American servicemen. Each package contained essential items such as cigarettes, confectionery, personal grooming products, and diversions. Local communities extended invitations for prisoners to partake in Christmas feasts, though official regulations largely precluded their acceptance. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in the German language for the internees. Women from the Hearn community contributed homemade cookies and cakes. The Boy Scouts delivered handcrafted Christmas greetings. This demonstration of benevolence towards adversaries irrevocably shattered the remaining vestiges of Nazi racial doctrine. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had perished during the aerial bombardment of Hamburg, articulated his observations. "They are aware of our animosity. Many possess sons and husbands actively engaged in combat against our armed forces. Yet they extend to us Christian charity, not as a product of calculated propaganda, but as a genuine expression of kindness. What manner of people exhibit such behavior towards their enemies? Only those who possess absolute certainty of their impending triumph and are secure in their inherent strength." The Christmas repast itself defied comprehension. Roast turkey, ham, mashed potatoes accompanied by gravy, an array of vegetables, various pies, and ice cream. The sheer abundance of sustenance recalled an era in Germany predating the First World War. The prisoners consumed to the point of discomfort, unable to fathom such lavish provision for those considered enemies. "We dined like royalty," wrote Feldwebel Hansa. "Better than German generals dine, better even than our party leaders." This was not presented as an exceptional circumstance. The guards informed us that this constituted a typical American Christmas dinner, mirroring the fare enjoyed by every American family. If such provisions were extended to prisoners, they mused, what must their own soldiers be consuming? By the dawn of 1944, in excess of 40,000 German prisoners were actively participating in educational initiatives. Their studies encompassed English, American history, mathematics, and various scientific disciplines. The University of Chicago provided instructional materials for correspondence courses. Stanford University dispatched faculty members to deliver lectures on the principles of democracy and economics. The intellectual curiosity exhibited was insatiable. Prisoners who had been indoctrified with the notion of Americans as culturally backward barbarians discovered extensive libraries housing millions of volumes, academic institutions embracing individuals from all societal strata, and scientific research that led the global community. They perused American newspapers without restriction, engaging with a multiplicity of perspectives, an opportunity utterly non-existent within Nazi Germany. Herr Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later reflected, "American professors, including Jewish émigrés from Germany, imparted knowledge to us without animosity. They discoursed on science as a universal pursuit, belonging to all humankind. Their research was years ahead of German endeavors, and they readily shared their discoveries with those perceived as adversaries. This magnanimity of spirit was beyond the grasp of minds shaped by Nazi ideology." The camp theaters showcased American motion pictures, not as instruments of propaganda, but as mainstream Hollywood productions. Prisoners viewed Gone with the Wind, experiencing a narrative of American adversity and subsequent recovery that resonated with their own predicaments. They also witnessed the grapes of wrath, expressing astonishment that Americans would present such self-critical portrayals to their adversaries. "They conceal nothing," observed Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. "They expose their challenges, their failures, their internal conflicts. Yet this candor serves to fortify them, not to diminish them. In Germany, such criticism would have resulted in death. Here, it is regarded as an act of patriotism." The spring of 1944 heralded the expansion of prisoner labor programs as American industrial output reached its zenith. German prisoners of war contributed to canneries, mills, and fabrication facilities, gaining first-hand insight into the comprehensive power of American manufacturing capacity. The sheer scale of these operations presented a narrative impervious to propaganda. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded the raw steel destined to become landing craft for the D-Day invasion. They observed the assembly of 700 boats each month, with each vessel requiring 20,000 distinct components. The factory employed 20,000 individuals, including thousands of women who operated cranes, performed welding on the hulls, and managed the assembly lines. Stabswachtmeister Kurt Zimmermann documented this observation. Women undertaking tasks traditionally performed by men, individuals of Negro descent operating sophisticated machinery, and teenagers manning drilling equipment, all elements we were led to believe were inconceivable within a democratic framework. Yet, production never faltered. Operations continued in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They manufactured more boats in a single month than our entire Navy had constructed in a year. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed the daily production of 10,000 tons of steel. The blast furnaces operated continuously, fueled by an unceasing flow of iron ore transported from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The magnitude of this operation defied German comprehension. This singular facility produced more steel than the entirety of the Ruhr region at its peak. "I was employed at the Krupp Works prior to the war," recounted Oberwerker Paul Hartmann. "I believed I understood industrial production, but this surpassed all imagination. They would discard more steel and waste than our entire nation could produce. The workers complained about working overtime while achieving production levels we could not attain, even with forced labor and double shifts." The agricultural harvest of the summer of 1944 delivered the ultimate demolition of Nazi propaganda regarding American feebleness. German prisoners labored across the Midwestern states, bearing witness to an agricultural output capable of sustaining the global population. In Kansas, they observed wheat harvests where individual farms yielded more grain than entire German provinces. Gigantic combine harvesters traversed the fields like vessels upon a golden ocean, each machine processing 100 acres per day. The grain elevators they replenished possessed capacities exceeding Germany's annual wheat imports. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, remarked, "A single American farmer, equipped with machinery, accomplishes the work of 100 German farmers." He was shown aerial photographs depicting wheat fields stretching for thousands of square miles. He noted that even with a 50% loss of harvest, they would still possess more grain than all of Europe combined. In California's Central Valley, prisoners engaged in fruit harvesting within orchards that extended beyond the horizon. They witnessed perfectly edible fruit being discarded due to minor imperfections, fruit that would have been cherished in Germany. Entire crops were occasionally plowed under to maintain market prices, a practice that induced profound psychological distress among prisoners hailing from a hunger-stricken Germany. "They annihilated food to stabilize prices," stated Gefreiter Otto Schultz. "Vast quantities of oranges were bulldozed into trenches because there was an excess. We implored to be permitted to send them to our families in Germany. The guards expressed sympathy but explained the impossibility of the request. This waste served as tangible proof of their boundless resources." The 6th of June, 1944. Upon the arrival of news concerning the Normandy landings in the prisoner camps, German internees experienced their final ideological capitulation. The sheer scale of the undertaking, 6,000 vessels, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 personnel in the initial assault wave, showcased an American organizational capability that far surpassed the wildest imaginings of Nazi Germany. Prisoners at Camp Shelby viewed newsreels of the invasion within days. They observed the ceaseless procession of ships, the construction of artificial harbors, and the logistical network that transported 15,000 tons of material daily across open beaches. They watched their homeland being overwhelmed by the very nation they had been assured was too enfeebled to contend. Our Friedrich von Tauben wrote, "We understood then that all was lost, not merely the war, but the entirety of the Nazi endeavor. We had challenged the world's preeminent industrial power with mere fables and racial mythology. We deployed horses against their mechanized transport, rifles against their automatic weaponry, and courage against their inexhaustible reserves." Throughout their confinement, German prisoners encountered an element that challenged Nazi ideology more profoundly than any material prosperity: American humanity. Despite propaganda portraying Americans as weak and sentimental, the prisoners of war discovered a populace secure enough in its strength to exhibit compassion. When Grenadier Hans Miller's son perished in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross notification and offered his condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife communicated her struggles in providing for their children, American church organizations dispatched food parcels to her in Germany, an act of kindness extended to civilians in a nation actively being subjected to American aerial bombardment. They drew a clear distinction between the German populace and the Nazi regime, observed Hedman Otto. They proclaimed their fight was against Hitler, not against Germans. This assertion, which initially seemed like propaganda, proved to be genuine. They prepared us for the reconstruction of Germany following the war, not for its annihilation. The medical treatment afforded to the prisoners was particularly impactful. German physicians collaborated with American medical staff, acquiring new techniques and utilizing advanced equipment. Prisoners underwent surgical procedures that, within Germany, would have been accessible only to the elite. Mental health care, virtually non-existent within the Wehrmacht, was provided to soldiers suffering from trauma. Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote, "Attempted suicides were addressed with counseling, not punishment. Prisoners experiencing mental breakdowns received therapeutic intervention, not physical abuse. This humane approach towards enemies revealed a strength we had never comprehended, the confidence of genuine power." By March of 1945, the clandestine re-education program had yielded remarkable outcomes. In excess of 25,000 prisoners had voluntarily enrolled in courses on democracy. The camp publications featured articles discussing constitutional governance, free market principles, and civil liberties. Discussion groups actively debated Germany's prospective future after the cessation of hostilities. The program's success far exceeded all initial projections. Prisoners who had arrived as ardent adherents of Nazism were now composing essays on democratic reconstruction. Officers who had sworn allegiance to Hitler were formulating plans for the implementation of American agricultural methodologies in post-war Germany. "We became emissaries for democracy," admitted Obersturmmann Hermann Göring, who bore no relation to the Reichsmarschall, in a 1975 interview. "Not through coercion or indoctrination, but through first-hand observation. We witnessed its efficacy. We observed ordinary individuals enjoying a superior standard of living compared to the German aristocracy. This was the future we desired for Germany." The transformation was so profound that American authorities expressed concern regarding the prisoners' excessive enthusiasm for American customs. Some individuals submitted requests to remain in the United States following the war's conclusion. Others entered into matrimony with American women they had encountered through prison correspondence programs. Thousands would subsequently immigrate to America during the 1950s. The month of April, 1945, brought the ultimate revelation. As American forces liberated concentration camps within Germany, visual evidence of these atrocities was presented to the German prisoners of war. Initially, many refused to accept its veracity, denouncing it as fabricated propaganda. However, the irrefutable evidence, testimony from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, and ultimately, correspondence from Germany confirming the horrific realities, rendered their denial untenable. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had clung to a vestige of pride in German honor despite military defeat now confronted the utter moral bankruptcy of their nation. Everything for which they had fought was not merely vanquished, but demonstrably malevolent. Headman Walter Schmidt offered the most eloquent summation. We perceived ourselves as combatants engaged in a noble cause. We discovered that we were merely instruments wielded by criminals. We believed we were bringing enlightenment to supposedly inferior peoples. We realized that we were, in fact, the barbarians. The Americans, whom we had characterized as weak and morally degenerate, demonstrated to us the true essence of civilization. As the war concluded in May of 1945, German prisoners of war faced repatriation with a complex admixture of emotions. They had borne witness to an America that starkly contradicted every belief they had previously held. They had been fed more generously as prisoners than they had ever been as soldiers. They had been treated with greater dignity by their adversaries than they had by their own government. The final months of their internment were dedicated to preparing for their return to a devastated Germany. American authorities provided vocational training, agricultural instruction, and political education. Prisoners were apprised of the Marshall Plan prior to its public announcement, comprehending that America intended to facilitate rebuilding rather than impose punitive measures upon Germany. They prepared us to reconstruct our country, wrote Oberst Friedrich von Tauben. They equipped us with skills, knowledge, and hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into prospective citizens. This magnanimity extended by the victors was a profound repudiation of vindictiveness. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German prisoners of war were repatriated from American internment facilities. They returned to a Germany characterized by division, devastation, and destitution. However, they carried with them an invaluable asset, an understanding of the functioning of a democratic industrial society. The German prisoners of war who experienced American prosperity inadvertently became agents of transformation in post-war Germany. They had observed industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity, and democratic affluence. They possessed the knowledge that reconstruction was not only feasible but achievable, having witnessed firsthand a society that had already attained these objectives. Many former prisoners ascended to positions of prominence in the rebuilding of West Germany. Hans Kroll, a former prisoner at Camp Shelby, later served as the West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who imparted instruction at Camp Co., assumed the presidency of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Marr, interned at Camp Herne, fulfilled the role of German permanent representative to the United Nations. Edward Ackerman, a prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a leading figure in German agricultural reform. They introduced American methodologies into German industry, American efficiency into German agriculture, and American democratic ideals into German politics. The economic resurgence of the 1950s was, in part, a consequence of the knowledge acquired within American prisoner of war camps. We learned that prosperity emanates from freedom, not from conquest, Hans Kroll elucidated in his memoirs. We observed that democracy engenders wealth, that diversity fosters strength, and that treating laborers equitably enhances productivity. These lessons, assimilated during our internment, fundamentally shaped the new Germany. Historians have acclaimed the experience of German prisoners of war in America as one of history's most successful re-education initiatives. Devoid of coercion or conventional propaganda, the potent combination of American industrial prowess and democratic principles succeeded in transforming staunch Nazis into future democratic citizens. The program's success was attributable to its reliance not on abstract rhetoric, but on concrete observation. Prisoners witnessed American society operating at peak efficiency while simultaneously extending dignified treatment to their adversaries. They observed an industrial capacity that rendered German production appear rudimentary. They experienced a standard of living that exposed the promises of Nazism as mere fantasies. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the foremost historian of German prisoners of war in America, concluded, "America secured victory in the propaganda war not through clever messaging, but through undeniable reality. Every substantial meal, every functioning electric light, every sanitary toilet served as a compelling argument against Nazism. The prisoners of war were converted by prosperity. Statistical data corroborates this assessment. Of the 371,683 German prisoners of war held in American facilities, fewer than 1% attempted escape, with a total of only 2,222 escape attempts recorded. Post-war surveys indicated that 95% rated their treatment as either good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained correspondence with American families for several decades following the war's conclusion. In 1985, coinciding with the 40th anniversary of the war's end, surviving German prisoners of war convened for a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former internees returned to the United States, many accompanied by their families to illustrate the genesis of their transformation. Former Oberleutnant Hans Vea, who had been detained at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and subsequently returned to practice medicine in Georgetown, Maine, addressed the assembly. Life within the camps represented a substantial improvement for many of us who had grown up in modest housing conditions in Germany, he stated. We discovered the convenience of running water, central heating, and an abundance of food. More significantly, however, we discovered dignity. Former Stabswachtmeister Kurt Meir, who had been employed on farms in Iowa, added, "The farmers treated us not as adversaries, but as young men far from their homes. They shared their meals, their knowledge, and on occasion, their residences." This humanitarianism, extended by individuals whose sons were engaged in combat against us, profoundly altered us forever. During the reunion banquet in 1985, former Oberst Hermann Gutz, then 78 years of age, delivered the keynote address, encapsulating the essence of their metamorphosis. "We arrived in America as enemies, as adherents of Nazism, as believers in a falsehood," he declared. "We departed as friends, as Democrats, as men who had encountered truth. America demonstrated that strength is derived not from conquest, but from productivity, not from animosity, but from diversity, not from authoritarianism, but from freedom. We witnessed the arsenal of democracy operating at its full capacity. We observed farmers who nourished the world, laborers who forged the instruments of victory, and citizens who treated their enemies with respect. We learned that America's true armament was not its ordnance or its armored vehicles, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unwavering self-assurance. We returned to Germany with a mandate to construct a society capable of creation rather than destruction, a society that could prosper through peace rather than war. The Germany that emerged from the ruins was founded upon lessons absorbed within American prisoner of war camps. We, who arrived as conquerors, departed as students. From America, our former adversaries, now your friends, thank you for illuminating our path." The auditorium erupted in a standing ovation. Americans and Germans, united, former adversaries brought together in recognition of a transformation that had seemed utterly inconceivable when the initial trains conveyed prisoners into Texas in June of 1943. The sheer magnitude of the German prisoner of war experience in America can be quantified through stark statistical data, illuminating both the vast scope of the undertaking and its extraordinary success. Camp infrastructure. Over 500 camps were established across 45 states, with every state represented except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. This network comprised 175 main camps and 325 satellite facilities, designed to accommodate between 250 and 12,000 prisoners each. Construction for each camp was typically completed within an average of 90 days. Prisoner population. A total of 371,683 German prisoners of war constituted a portion of the 425,871 total Axis prisoners held. The peak population was recorded in May of 1945. The influx of new arrivals averaged 20,000 per month in 1943, increasing to 30,000 monthly following D-Day and reaching 60,000 monthly during the war's final months. Labor contribution. Prisoners provided 14 million man-days of agricultural labor and processed 100 million board feet of lumber, valued at $230 million in 1940s currency, with a daily wage of 80 cents per prisoner. Prisoners effectively addressed critical labor shortages in 46 states. Escape statistics. From a population exceeding 371,000 prisoners, only 2,222 escape attempts were recorded, representing a mere 0.6%. There were 0 successful permanent escapes. The vast majority of escapees were apprehended within 24 hours, and no American civilians suffered harm at the hands of escaped prisoners. Educational programs. Over 40,000 prisoners enrolled in academic courses. 135 camp newspapers were published. 30,000 prisoners participated in English language classes, 15,000 in vocational training programs, and 8,000 utilized university correspondence courses. Post-war immigration. Approximately 5,000 former prisoners of war immigrated to the United States after the war. 12,000 individuals maintained correspondence with American families, with an average correspondence duration of 31 years. Many returned as tourists or business associates. Treatment assessment. 95% of prisoners rated their treatment as either good or excellent. 74% believed their captivity had positively altered their worldview. 61% expressed an interest in learning about democracy. Less than 10% retained strong Nazi beliefs by 1945. The German prisoners of war who encountered the immense power of American industry did not merely observe history, they were profoundly reshaped by it. Their internment evolved into a form of education, their defeat into a process of enlightenment, and their imprisonment into liberation from the ideological shackles of Nazism. Ultimately, America's most significant triumph was not achieved on the battlefield, but within the confines of its prison camps, where the overwhelming testament to democratic prosperity accomplished what armies could not: the complete reorientation of enemy minds. The German prisoners of war, initially convinced of Teutonic supremacy and American frailty, departed with a starkly altered understanding. The sheer magnitude of American industry transcended mere overwhelming force. It was a concept utterly foreign to minds accustomed to deprivation and authoritarian rule. The same locomotives that had transported these soldiers of the Third Reich into captivity in 1943 were the very same vessels that carried the architects of a burgeoning democracy back to Germany in 1946. They had glimpsed a future, and it was demonstrably functional. Their experience serves as a profound testament to a fundamental truth. The most potent instrument in America's arsenal was not its military hardware, but the undeniable and overwhelming manifestation of a free society's inherent capacity to generate boundless prosperity. The German POWs, initially awestruck by American industrial prowess, were ultimately converted by its undeniable efficacy. Within their metamorphosis lay the nascent potential for Europe's post-war revival and the ultimate undoing of the Nazi ideology. They returned to their homeland not as vanquished adversaries, but as credible witnesses to the extraordinary achievements of free societies. The economic renaissance that revitalized West Germany during the 1950s was fundamentally rooted in the very grounds of American internment facilities, where captured soldiers discovered that affluence stemmed not from conquest, but from liberty, not from racial hierarchy, but from human worth, and not from absolute governmental control, but from cooperative democratic engagement. The German POWs had journeyed to America, anticipating a fractured and faltering nation on the precipice of collapse. Instead, they encountered an industrial titan possessing seemingly infinite power, coupled with an unexpected vein of compassion. They had arrived as captives of war, yet departed as observers of the democratic arsenal at its absolute zenith. Their profound admiration for American abundance held within it the psychological genesis of the Atlantic Alliance, the provisions of the Marshall Plan, and the democratic restructuring of Germany. Their encounter with America was a life-altering event. Their offspring would mature within a democratic Germany, aligned in partnership with the United States. This alliance was forged on the crucible of transformation that commenced when 185,000 veterans of the Afrika Korps disembarked from a train in Mexia, Texas, and realized the utter falsity of their deeply held convictions. The narrative of German POWs in America is, at its core, a story of redemption through profound revelation. It unequivocally demonstrates that sometimes The most significant triumphs are achieved not through obliteration, but through compelling illustration. Not through pervasive falsehoods, but through tangible abundance. And not through animosity, but through universal empathy. The German soldiers who bore witness to America's formidable industrial strength inadvertently became emissaries of democracy, carrying back to their native soil the seeds of change that would ultimately blossom into one of history's most celebrated reconstructions. Their transition from adherents of Nazism to proponents of democracy remains an unparalleled transformation in recent history, accomplished not through coercion, but through the irrefutable evidence of what free individuals could accomplish through collective endeavor. Ultimately, that was America's clandestine advantage. Not merely the capacity to manufacture an unprecedented volume of material, but the ability to convert adversaries into allies through the sheer, unadorned power of positive example. The German POWs, though astonished by America's industrial might, were more significantly molded by it. And within that profound alteration lay the bedrock for an improved global order.